You know, we throw around words like liberty and equality all the time, but have you ever stopped to think about where they really came from? Well, let me tell you, their story isn't some peaceful lecture. It's written in blood, and one of its most explosive, world-changing chapters kicked off in 18th century France. So let's dive into the French Revolution.
Okay, I want you to picture this. It's Paris, July 14th, 1789. The entire city is a powder keg just waiting for a spark. You've got royal troops flooding the streets, and this terrifying rumor is spreading like wildfire that the king is about to just open fire on his own people. So, in this desperate act of self-defense, thousands of ordinary folks, shopkeepers, craftsmen, laborers, they form a militia. But they need weapons, and they know exactly where to get them. Inside the Bastille, that grim old fortress prison that just looms over the city, a symbol of the king's absolute terrifying power. I mean, regular citizens storming a fortress, clashing with royal soldiers right in the streets? This is way more than just a riot. This is what a society at its absolute breaking point looks like. So the big question is, how on earth did it get here? To really understand the explosion, we've got to look at the pressure that had been building up, not for years, but for centuries. So welcome to what historians call the old regime. That's the fancy term for French society before everything blew up. It was a system that had been around forever, and it was, to put it simply, dangerously unfair. French society was sliced into three rigid groups, or estates. And honestly, this chart tells you everything you need to know. You've got the first estate, the clergy. The second estate, the nobility. Together, they're a tiny fraction of the population, but they hold all the wealth and power. And the third estate? Well, that was literally everyone else. More than 9 out of 10 people in France. Now, just look at that last column. See the problem? They were the only ones paying taxes. All of them. And this wasn't just about government taxes. The key thing to get here is that this was a system of privilege that was baked in from the moment you were born. Nobles didn't just get out of paying taxes, they actually collected their own dues from peasants who lived on their land. The church collected its own tax too, called the tithe. So you have the third estate, the vast majority of people, single-handedly funding the entire country. The army, the government, the king's ridiculously lavish court at Versailles, all of it on their backs. And this popular cartoon from the time, it just perfectly captures how people felt. You see the nobleman as the fat spider, happy in his web, and the peasant as the fly, completely trapped, just having the life drained out of him. The whole system was designed to suck wealth from the many to benefit the very, very few. All right, so you've got this deeply unequal society just simmering with anger. Now, let's throw two new, incredibly explosive ingredients into the mix that turned all that anger into a revolution, a desperate struggle for survival, and a radical battle of ideas. First up, a massive population boom. In just over 70 years, France's population shot up by 5 million people. Think about that. All those new mouths to feed put a huge strain on the food supply, especially grain, which was the main thing people ate. The farmers just couldn't keep up with demand. And second, the government was flat broke. I mean, completely bankrupt. Decades of incredibly expensive wars, and get this, that includes bankrolling the American Revolution against their old enemy, Britain, had left the royal treasury empty. The state was drowning in over 3 billion livres of debt. The government was spending almost half its budget just paying the interest on its loans. It was a total economic death spiral. And here's where you can see how all these problems created this vicious cycle. So a bad harvest hits. That means there's not enough grain, which means the price of bread, the one food that kept most people alive, it just skyrockets. But people's wages, they stay the same. All of a sudden, the poorest people literally cannot afford to eat. This cycle of hunger and desperation is called a subsistence crisis, and it was becoming a terrifyingly normal part of life. At the exact same time all this is happening, you've got a revolution of the mind going on. Philosophers from the Enlightenment were questioning everything about the old regime. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau were arguing that a king's power doesn't come from God. No, he said a real government should be based on a social contract, basically an agreement between the people and the people they choose to represent them. This was an absolutely radical idea. And then you had Montesquieu, who came up with an idea that struck right at the heart of absolute monarchy, the separation of powers. His point was, to stop anyone from becoming a tyrant, you had to split up the government's power, divide it between a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary. No single person, especially not a king, should have total control. These were dangerous new ideas, and they were spreading like crazy, giving people a blueprint for a totally new kind of France. So, let's recap the ingredients. We've got an unjust social pyramid, we have widespread hunger, a government that's broke, and these electrifying new ideas about freedom and power. In the year 1789, it all came to a head. And what happened next moved at a speed that is just breathtaking. In May, the king calls a meeting to try and get more tax money. By June, the Third Estate has basically told him to get lost and declared itself the new government. In July, Paris explodes and the Bastille falls. And by August, the whole feudal system is gone. A social order that had stood for 1,000 years was torn down in a single summer. So what was the spark? Well, the king, desperate for cash, called a meeting of the Estates General, kind of like a parliament, for the first time in 175 years. But the rules were rigged. Under the old system, each estate got one vote. That meant the clergy and nobility could always team up and outvote the Third Estate, 2-1. The Third Estate said, no way. They demanded a new system, one person, one vote. It was a fight for simple, fair representation. So when the king said no to their demand for fair voting, he literally locked them out of the meeting hall. But they didn't go home. Instead, they just marched over to a nearby indoor tennis court. And in this legendary moment, they took an oath. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true voice of the people. And they swore they would not stop meeting until they had written a brand new constitution for France. Make no mistake, this was not a protest. This was a seizure of power. As news from Paris spread, this wave of panic and rebellion just rolled across the countryside. It's now known as the Great Fear. Peasants who were convinced that the nobles were sending armies to crush them grabbed their pitchforks and fought back. They attacked manor houses, they looted green, and, this is key, they found and burned the feudal records. Those were the ancient documents that legally tied them to the land and to their lords. They weren't just rioting, they were systematically erasing the paper chains of the old world. Faced with full-blown revolution in Paris and in the countryside, the king really had no choice but to back down. So the National Assembly got to work, trying to build a new France from the ashes of the old one. What happened next is honestly one of the most remarkable nights in modern history. In a single, wild, all-night session on August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly just voted to abolish the entire feudal system. Noble privileges, special dues, church taxes, all of it, gone. In one night, they wiped away a social structure that had defined France for 1,000 years. By 1791, they had their constitution. It turned France into a constitutional monarchy. So the king was still there, but his power was seriously limited. That idea from Montesquieu about separating powers, it was now the law. But, and this is a big but, look closely at that last point, the right to vote. It wasn't for everybody. You had to be an active citizen, which meant you had to be a man over 25 who paid a decent amount in taxes. And this created a whole new class divide between active citizens and passive citizens. And that passive group, it included all the poor men and, crucially, every single woman in France. They were now subjects of this new government, but they had absolutely no voice in it. The revolution had promised liberty and equality for all, but it was becoming pretty clear that some people were going to be more equal than others. So an absolute king's power was broken. A society built on centuries of privilege was torn down. A constitution was written. On the surface, it really looks like the end of the story, right? But for the millions of those passive citizens who were still shut out, for a king who was secretly plotting to get his power back, and for the revolutionaries who thought the changes didn't go nearly far enough, a huge question was hanging in the air. Was the revolution actually over, or had it really just begun?